Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. She is in her carriage when they find her. It is March of 415 CE. The city is in its season of Lenten observance, the streets moving with the particular intensity that religious seasons impose on public space, the atmosphere charged in ways that are difficult to name precisely, but impossible to mistake. She has made this passage through the grid streets of Alexandria hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. The philosopher's cloak, the particular angle of a mind always half occupied with whatever problem is currently under consideration. The city familiar around her in the way that a city becomes familiar to a person who has inhabited it without apology for 40 years. They stop the carriage. There are enough of them that the stopping requires no particular effort. The men blocking the street are not here for her counsel. What follows will be addressed in full, with the precision the sources allow and the honesty the gaps require, once the city that made her is properly understood. But the destination of this episode is already visible from here. The lecture hall does not fill again. Part 1 of this series established a mind and the world it inhabited. Alexandria in the late 4th century, the tradition of the Musaean, the father who transmitted everything he knew to his daughter and watched her exceed him. Part 2 traced the political machinery assembling itself around her in the years after 412 CE. The arrival of Bishop Cyril, the conflict with the prefect Orestes, the expulsion of the Jewish community, the stone thrown at the prefect's head in a public street, the dead monk elevated to martyrdom, the parabalani moving with increasing visibility through a city that was becoming, by measurable degrees, a different kind of place. This part is the end of the arc. It will be told with the same precision the previous episodes demanded, which means acknowledging where the sources agree, registering where they diverge, and refusing to deliver false certainty on the questions the historical record leaves open. The proximate cause of Hypatia's death, as reported by Socrates Scholasticus, writing approximately 24 years after the events, the earliest and most detailed source available, was the circulation of a specific accusation that Hypatia was the reason Orestes would not be reconciled with Cyril. The conflict between the prefect and the bishop had ground on for years. It had taken hostages, the Jewish community, the monk Ammonius, the credibility of the civil authority, and it had produced no resolution. Someone in the volatile atmosphere of early 415 determined that this stalemate had a cause that could be removed. The sources do not record Cyril issuing an order. What they record is the political logic as Socrates understood it, and as subsequent scholarship has largely confirmed, that Hypatia, as the prefect's most visible ally, and as the embodiment of the intellectual tradition Cyril's episcopate was systematically displacing, had become, in the perception of certain factions within the Church, the specific obstacle whose removal would change the calculation. Whether this perception was accurate, whether Hypatia's counsel to Orestes was in fact the binding constraint on any reconciliation, is a different question. Perceptions of this kind do not require accuracy in order to have consequences. The mob was led by a man named Peter, identified in Socrates as a reader, a lector. a minor ecclesiastical functionary. They intercepted her carriage in the street and took her to the Caesareum, the great church that had been, in an earlier Alexandria, a temple to the imperial cult, a building whose own history encoded the transformation of the city in stone. What happened inside is where the sources must be held carefully. Socrates Scholasticus records that she was stripped and killed with ostraca, a term meaning roof tiles, potsherds, or the sharp oyster shells littering the Alexandrian coast. Her remains were burned. On this outline, the earliest sources converge. On specific details of the killing they diverge, and the script will not select the most dramatic version from the full tradition, when the earliest and most reliable account is what we have. The scholar Edward Watts has argued, in his 2017 biography of Hypatia, that the mob likely did not set out to kill her. His reading of the evidence suggests an intent to publicly humiliate or coerce, to strip a prominent pagan intellectual of her authority in front of the city, perhaps to force a conversion or a renunciation of Orestes in the manner of organized intimidation that had already been deployed against the prefect's supporters. If that was the intention, it shattered into something else entirely. The violence escalated beyond whatever had been planned, and Hypatia did not leave the Caesareum. This reading does not dissolve the institutional context that made the violence possible. It does complicate the simpler story of a calculated assassination ordered from the top, and it is worth holding alongside the other evidence rather than discarding, because history rarely moves in straight lines between a powerful man's ambitions and a body on the floor of a church. One other ancient voice requires registration here, and it requires maximum epistemic skepticism. John of Nicaea, a bishop writing in Coptic, his chronicle surviving only in an Ethiopic translation, composed roughly 2.5 centuries after the events, presents a markedly different account. In his telling, Hypatia was a sorceress who had beguiled Orestes through magic. Her death was accordingly presented as a justified consequence of her corrupting influence on the city's governor. This account does not merit the same credibility as Socrates Scholasticus, who was a contemporary. It is the record of a hostile tradition, written long after the fact, by a writer with obvious doctrinal investments in the conclusion he reached. It is included here not as evidence about Hypatia, but as evidence about what certain quarters of the early Christian tradition needed her to be, and about the speed with which a city can re-narrate the woman it has just destroyed. The aftermath is documented. Orestes wrote to Constantinople. He had done this before, when the Jewish community was expelled, when the prefect's own blood was on the paving stones. The imperial court received the reports. What followed was insufficient to match the scale of what had occurred. Cyril faced no serious ecclesiastical or imperial consequences. He remained Bishop of Alexandria until his death in 444 CE, presiding over a church whose institutional authority in the city was no longer contested in any meaningful sense. He was subsequently declared a saint and a doctor of the church. The signals sent by this outcome to every remaining figure associated with the old intellectual tradition was legible without requiring interpretation. The city's pluralism, The productive tension between Greek philosophical tradition, Roman civil authority, and Christian institutional ambition that had been Alexandria's defining characteristic for generations, had resolved at last and definitively in one direction. The resolution had a body. Orestes disappears from the documentary record within months. His position in the city had become untenable, and the sources do not preserve what became of him. Many of Hypatia's students left. The sources record an exodus of intellectuals toward Athens, which developed a significant reputation in mathematics and philosophy in the years immediately following. Ancient learning did not end in the Caesareum in March of 415. The Athenian school continued for another century. The tradition persisted in other cities, in other hands, for a long time. What ended was Hypatia. The primary source for these events is Socrates Scholasticus, whose Historia Ecclesiastica was written approximately 2 decades after the fact. He names Peter the lector as the leader of the mob, identifies the Caesareum as the location, and records the killing by ostraca and the burning of remains. His account is the earliest and most detailed available. The question of Cyril's personal culpability has occupied scholars for 15 centuries and remains unresolved. No direct order from Cyril survives. The political logic of his interest in Hypatia's removal is documented. The chain of institutional responsibility connecting his episcopate to the men who acted is documented. His failure to condemn what occurred is documented. Whether these constitute culpability of the order, historians have sometimes attributed to him, is a question the archive declines to answer cleanly. On the claim of Hypatia's complete erasure, it requires precision. No independent text bearing her name alone survives, but her contributions are not entirely lost. Theon explicitly credited her with revising Book 3 of the Almagest, and scholars, including Alan Cameron, have identified her hand in specific passages of surviving commentaries. Her words exist today braided into her father's work, present but without a room of their own. The claim that her death marked the end of ancient learning is a later construction, shaped heavily by Enlightenment writers, who found in her story a useful emblem for arguments about religious authority and intellectual freedom. The actual history is more complex. The symbolic weight assigned to 415 CE is, in significant part, retrospective. What the historical record preserves of Hypatia is, in the deepest sense, a problem of absence. We know her almost entirely through others, through the letters of students who revered her, through chronicles written by men with competing agendas, through the records of a city that destroyed her and then spent 15 centuries arguing about what that act meant. What it meant at its most essential is this: a woman who had built her life on the clean line of demonstrated understanding, the theorem correctly stated, the sky correctly measured, the political situation precisely read, was removed from the world by men for whom her clarity was an obstacle. Not her error, her precision. The question that does not resolve, that the archive forces us to sit with without offering relief, is whether anything she might have continued to produce, continued to ask, continued to transmit, can in any sense be recovered. The lecture hall can be imagined. The wax tablet can be imagined. The hand moving without hesitation. What cannot be recovered is the next problem she would have solved, and the one after that. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.